We are moving on to our next session. We have with us Dr. Aparna Eswaran, Assistant Professor, School of International Relations and Politics, Mahatma Gandhi University. Dr. Eswaran brings a wealth of expertise from her doctoral research in women's studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she explored the themes of gender, conflict, and witnessing with a particular focus on the experiences and expressions of Tamil women in Sri Lanka. Her interdisciplinary approach is further strengthened by her advanced degrees in international organization and politics from JNU. Today, she will be delivering a talk titled Witnessing and War, Remembering Enforced Disappearance in Sri Lanka. Dr. Eswaran, we invite you to begin.
Thank you for that introduction.
Full screen?
Yeah. So what I would you can do this, right? Okay. Thank you to the organizers of the conference, especially Dr. Shilpa and Dr. Komath sir, for inviting me kindly to share my work. It's not very often that you get to share your work in space that you also work in. The title of my talk is Witnessing and War, Remembering Enforced Disappearances in Sri Lanka. This paper is actually an attempt to extend my PhD work, which was on women witnessing war through poetry written by Tamil women in and from Sri Lanka between the period 1981 to 2009. I used the category of witness to understand how women in the most difficult of circumstances of living through a war articulated what it meant to be Tamil, and also, which is a persecuted minority in that context, and what it meant to be a woman, the marginalized within the minority in a deeply patriarchal society through their writings, especially their poetry. I want to extend this category of bearing witness to the post-conflict period in Sri Lanka, a period which is marked by the grand rhetoric of development and reconciliation, and also look at the subsequent failures in restorative justice, which can be termed as irreconciliations. So if we look at the 30-year-long civil war, terrible atrocities, of course, were committed by both sides of the, or not both sides, it cannot be a binary categorization in the sense, two main parties involved in the war, which is the Sri Lankan government and the LTT, but not equally. The culpability is, of course, not on equal terms. The scale and nature of this conflict reaches its horrific zenith between January 2009 to May 2009. And you should understand that this period was actually called as the war without witness. But during this time, poetry as a mode of witness still continued on. If you look at 1983, there was an anthology called Maranathul Vazhvum, which was published, which basically means we will live amidst death, which inaugurated a genre of poetry called poetry of political protest, which included poets like Cheran, Jayapalan, Aravindan and Ahilan. The poetry produced in this period is marked by the important events during the war and the act of writing through it. In certain ways, it's evidencing it. The important events, if you look at it, the anti-Tamil program of 1983, Jaffna Library being burned in 1981, the deployment of IPKF in 1987, all of which quickly exceeds its power, exceeds the violence that has seen till then. The violence perpetrated by LTT, where they targeted the other minority community, the Muslims, in 1990. So even things which are not usually talked about. The ceasefire period brokered by Norwegians, the devastating tsunami of 2004, and of course the official end of the war on 18th May of 2009. All of this is inscribed in the poetry of witness. Yet, these poems are not ordinary records of important events. It's a collection of multiple responses, differing views, different experiences that shun the objectivity of a singular history. It also bears the struggles of confronting a world marked with the brutality as well as the banality of wartime violence. In order to convey the pain and trauma of war, in which the everyday is marked with experience of death, disappearances, and displacement, even new poetic forms were devised. So you see, this poem is sort of written like a hospital record. So the poems also re-inscribed the traditional poetics of Tamil poetry, which is the division into of private and public, right? Agam poems and the Puram poems and the Thinai system. So the poetics of landscape, as you say in Tamil, also underwent changes during the war. So the injuries to the collective social psyche of Tamils started by so you see depictions of blown up palmyra trees, metaphors of rising agitated sea drained of water. With experience of alienation and displacement, experiences of war, poets also developed cityscapes of alienation, snowscapes of exile and diaspora, landscapes of imagination and fantasy world. The poetry of women, written between 1981 and 2009, also reflected the varied experience of being a Tamil woman. Here again, please note that it is not a singular monolithic category, and that women have also sort of negotiated this understanding of this Tamil women in very different different registers from the place they came, the religion that they belong to, etc. So one of this is Sollada Seidikal, the first anthology which was brought out by women, in fact from a university setting like ours, from Jaffna University. A couple of women got together, students got together, and then they formed this women's study circle, and this the first anthology is actually a result of this idea of what V. Geeta very evocatively calls as the tentative feminism arching its way out of a blasted yet dramatic space. On the other hand, poetry of women combatants like Ambuli, Captain Bharati, Vanadi, Kasturi, who wrote about their experience of being a combatant, right? Somebody who was wielding weapons for militant nationalism, also started being written. There was a persistence of heroism in their work, loss of friends and comrades to war, a tragic freedom that they experience, which is linked to their ability to wield guns and to kill for the nation. On the other hand, there is also stringent kind of feminist critique which comes in terms of poetry by poets like Shivaramani and Selvi and Avvai, where they recognize the tragic and violent turn in nationalism, Tamil nationalism, which has happened, where LTT becomes the only voice of militant nationalism, when there was around 100 different militant outfits at the start of the face of Tamil militant nationalism. Shelva Kanaganayagan, who was a well-known Tamil critic, he says that the poetry produced during this period shows its commitment to political realism, in the sense that experience rather than form becomes the major concern of poetry at this point of period. So I take on this idea which comes from Sumati Shivamohan, who's a academician, who's a poet, who's also a director. She comes up with this idea. This is an idea which comes up from Nilofer Demel's work on Sumati Shivamohan's poetry, and this idea is called poetry of witness. So she's drawing upon Agamben's work, and the writer is a witness, right? So Demel says that a writer acts as a witness in two senses, and these two senses comes from the etymology, two different kinds of etymology of the word witness. The first meaning of witness is derived from the Latin word testis, from which the word testimony comes, which signifies a person who in a trial between two parties occupies a third position. Basically, somebody who's neutral, right? A very legalistic kind of an understanding of witness. The second meaning derives from the word superstes, which designates a person who has lived through an event and therefore can bear witness to that event, right? In the sense, a superstite or a supervisor in every sense. So this does not mean that the poet has to occupy a median ground. So there is also a possibility of creation of political communities of living with grief, right? Of living with grief of going through a war. And one can interpret, at one sense, poetry as a very private experience, but as Demel points out, poetry can also be alert to the relational frameworks of vulnerable individuals, right? Here she is drawing on that idea from Judith Butler, work on precarious life, the power of mourning and violence, where you say that the relationality of the vulnerable individual to her surroundings, this vulnerability is following from the fact that we are all socially constituted beings, right? Which means that we are all interconnected, but of course there is this vulnerability that you will be hurt. But this attachments in itself, which is also a possibility of being hurt, but these attachments in itself can also give rise to political communities, right? The grief that you're going through, the hurt you're going through, can be the basis on which political communities can emerge. So, um, though the war was brutally brought to an end in May 2009, the violence faced by Tamils and Muslims in Sri Lanka still continues. And memory emerges as a deeply contested terrain in post-conflict Sri Lanka. The post in post-conflict is a continuation of violence seen in multiple instances of irreconciliation. Here in my paper, I am looking at one such instance, which is the protest which is put forward by mothers of the disappeared and the relatives of the enforced disappeared. So, one of the insidious ways in which violence is being perpetuated by the post-conflict regimes that have come into power in Sri Lanka is an erasure of the history of Tamil people and struggle through official interdictions and bans on memory and remembering. So, this is literal bulldozing of monuments which has happened within Sri Lanka. So, this Sumati Shimohan sort of terms it as aesthetics of triumphalism. An example of this is the massacre ground in the last end of the war, right, January to May 2009 period, is called the Nandikada Lagoon. And this Nandikada Lagoon was changed to house a resort called the Lagoon's Edge soon after the war. And bunkers and war hopes of LTT Supremo Prabhakaran were then turned into tourist sites. Right? As Francis Harrison reminds us, on the far side of the lagoon from the hotel built by the army lies the sandy pit of land which is considered Sri Lanka's killing field, where people were crammed in haphazard makeshift encampments and then pounded by bombs, places where people were killed, right? And if you look at the newspaper advertisement for Lagoon's Edge, it says that they're inviting the guests to spend a night beside the lagoon where the Tamil tiger rebel leader Vedupalli Prabhakaran died. They're advertising it. So, what I'm trying to say is that there was a rhetoric of development, there is a rhetoric of moving on, which is also seen very much in this kind of tourism. You should give more importance to development and tourist activities and not think about what has happened to you. So the whole onus and the whole burden to move on was on the Tamils and to forget what happened to them. And this was what prompted Gauri Konneshwari. She's a queer Tamil American poet and performing artist whose family immigrated to US from Sri Lanka to write this poem called How to Enjoy a Vacation to a Country that says it won the war. So I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but she's calling out the tourists, right, who are sort of, going in flocks, who are flocking to Sri Lanka by saying that while planning your journey, accept that ethics is not included in the price of your ticket. Tell yourself your currency is helping the country. Do not question government control of tourism industry. And she says that, she writes, when researching your destination, skip the sections on families in camps, book a tour even if the army will not give them back their land. So the violence which is very much implicit in your act of being a tourist is also sort of put forward. And if you look at the form, it's like a checklist, right? A checklist that we carry before traveling. You put stars and then, write it. So here, as an aside, I should say that LTT as a entity very well understood the importance of memory and was very well known to have used memory for their nation building efforts in itself. The systematic calendrical events, commemorative martyrs, sprawling cemeteries for their fallen cadres, which is what we see in the middle, right? And the other one is a monument meant for Dilipan, who was a martyr who sort of was sitting for a ceasefire and then on a non-violent kind of a samaram, and but was sort of died in the process and was turned into a martyr within the LTT iconography. But soon after the war, there was defacement of the statue, and you see how the Tuilum Illams, which is basically sleeping abodes of martyrs. So LTT was also very, very categorical in burying all their martyrs in one singular place, so that there is one place of memorial place, Pierre Nora's work, right, where you invest a place, an outside force creating a memory in space, but for national purposes in this regard, right. So, but it has to be noted that the systemic destruction was not just about LTT cemeteries, but also statues, pillars, gardens constructed by local residents to remember civilian deaths, people who are close to your family members, right? One such case is there was this monument within Jaffna University campus. In the middle of the pandemic, in midnight, the army people came in and then demolished for what reason? Because this whole idea that memory is something which can be very militant in nature also, right? In the sense that it can harm us. So in this juncture, social media and online space sort of emerged as grounds to express dissent. This is taken from this Instagram account of Seiji, who's an activist who's working within Sri Lanka. If you look at it's different tiles, and each tile kind of represents a person who has been unaccounted for during what they call as the Tamil genocide in 2009 at the end of the war, right? And it's based sorry. So so the number is 169796. That is the number of people who went unaccounted, and the color which is used is the corresponding hex code. This is Mullivaikal Kanyi. So at the end of the war, the people had absolutely no other way but to make rice gruel. So even today, when Sri Lanka sort of celebrates May 18th as the day of victory, Tamils across the world, as documented on their social accounts also, they make this very frugal kind of kanji that we are so familiar with in commemoration of what happened to them. Very quickly, there is a state-led reconciliation process which has happened in Sri Lanka, which is called the Lessons Learned Commission. But it was an utter failure because it happened because Mahinda Rajapaksa was being pulled out by the international forces, and it said that something has to happen, and it was almost like a mask to say that we are doing things but not really doing anything. But the important point for us to notice is that women did participate in large numbers in LLRC. And what was the reason for it was that they say that we have a right to know and also a right to have compensation on what happened. So, but they are sort of talking about this right to know, and here is where enforced disappearances come into space, right? In the whole of the world, if you take, Sri Lanka has the second largest number of enforced disappearances. Basically, disappearances enforced by the state agencies and police and army agencies, right? And what happens with there's this whole idea of corpus delicti, right? Which Thomas Lacker sort of writes on it, because it's not just this dead body, right? Finding the body, having the body back is not just a dead body, but it's an evidence of crime, right? Having said that, it is a consequence of step by step, agent by agent, cause by cause sequence of an instrument, which is basically the state is very much complicit in the absence of this corpus delicti being produced. And also we know that with disappearance, unlike death, there is no closure. There's always a limbo. That is where you are sort of I don't have time to go into the poetry which deals with it. Wonderful poems have been written about it. The poem that I wanted to look at is where she's writing to a fellow friend who's a fellow mourner, somebody who used to mourn together when people were passing, and now I have to mourn for you. I'll just read out the last two sentences of it. We did not know then that loss would touch us all again and again, and I would mourn you too when I am not others. So, I don't have time to go into the mothers of the disappeared also, but it's this political where women are taking a very patriarchal role which has been given to them, which is of mothering and caregiving, and then turning into an act of claiming citizenship, right? And there's a long history of mothers' fronts within Sri Lanka, starting from 80s to also in post-conflict period. Here I'm just looking at this film installation by Kannan Arunachalam, who's trying to document these women sort of waiting for information, right to know, but waiting for information. So you see, it is like 2-channel film installation. One is in color and one is in black and white. And one shows the women on the days of the protest, which is high on emotions, grief, and there's a lot of attention on them. But on the left side, you see the women waiting. And this is the color projection shows 2 or 3 women keeping vigil. Long, slow-paced shots communicate time passing. They sweep the tense floor, maintain a fire, and make tea. But you never witness these. So in one way that you can look at this is by Veena Das's idea of repair, right? Women's, like the everyday repair that women have to go through. But I am also looking at protest at that one available venue when they don't have to be, they are definitely performing, but that's the only avenue that they get to perform their grief also. I end by showing you this new artist, Susiman Nirmala Vasan's. He has his work is not Christian art, but the theme is mostly Christian, but he's talking about things which have happened in Sri Lanka. Here, as you know, he's using Mother Mary's image, but the photograph is of the missing son. And this is very evident because you see that to be one recurring trope in all protests of these women. A separate section of the paper actually works on use of photography in these protests, which hopefully some other day I'll get to discuss. And I stop here by talking about this one poem by Aryal. Aryal is an Australian writer, and so her poetry has that displacement. So there are a lot of snowscapes, cityscapes, etc. there. But the wonderful part, I'm not going to read the poem. The wonderful part is how she's using the Persephone myth, the myth of the abduction of Persephone, the Greek myth of abduction of Persephone by Hades, and her mother Demeter, who is then going around looking for information of her daughter, and at the end it is the witch goddess, the goddess of the night, the Hecate, who actually helps her. And there is this one line where she says, "No one spoke upon her behalf, no eye shed one tear, no living creature came forward as witness." But you see that Hecate did come up, and then it shows how mothers of it disappeared as a political community has emerged from the common grief they have about not having information on their lost ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Now the floor will be open for discussion, and humble request, please be precise on your questions and comment. We are really sorry for the inconvenience.
If there are no questions, then I can read out that poem. Right? I read out the poem. She has walked and walked for 9 long days. All of 9 days and 9 long nights have passed by. Weary of wandering as she is, the mad woman mutters brokenly, "Have you seen my daughter? Have you seen her?" All along the path she takes, the heavy clouds freeze. 1,000 birds fly past in scorn, and the winds howl aloud. No man or woman would help her, nor would the great gods come to her aid. Wherever she walked, at the touch of her feet, all the plants burn and blacken. No one spoke upon her behalf. No eye shed one tear. No living creature came forward as witness. She walks on, mumbling, "My daughter, my daughter." The earth hardens and freezes along her path. Fields of corns, their ears ripe and milky, rot from their very roots. Flowers lose their golden pollen and wither. Honeybirds die and fall like dead leaves, while the tall trees lose themselves in profound sleep. Wastelands of snow, only wastelands of snow will I grant you, she fumes within as she walks on and on. On the 10th day, look, there she comes, Hecate, the heart of the dark with the faces of the night hours. She comes from the place where time's cycle meet. I heard your daughter scream, but I haven't seen her, she says, abruptly pointing to the south. Then the goddess of the dark nights and of all things black urges her hounds to run ahead, raises her two torches of light on high to light the way as she hastens along with the mother. Not a god blinks an eye. All tongues are shocked into silence. They travel through dense forests of betrayals, humiliations, and falsehoods to find at last the daughter tasting sweet, sour pomegranate pearls. With their own eyes, they saw the daughter, and then with her, they returned home. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Now I request Professor Sanal Mohan to hand over a token of gratitude to Aparna. Thank you all. Without much delay, we'll move on to our next session.